All right. Hopefully people are filtering in. I see the numbers are still going up, so I'll give it another 15 seconds. All right. I think it's a good time to start. Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to this roundtable, and thank you for attending. Thank you, the Modern European History Collective, for putting this together, and to Carleton University for providing the technology support for this webinar. This is Why European History? Why Now? A roundtable discussion. And we have 4 wonderful panelists who we're looking forward to hearing from on these questions. And we're also looking forward to hearing what all of you want to know about why European history, why now. So this will be run in a webinar format. So please put your questions as you have them in the Q&A box, and I will be reading those and relaying those to the panelists as things go along. And we're just going to start by asking them a couple of questions. So I'll start by introducing our 4 panelists. So first we have Anita Kurimay, who's an associate professor at Bryn Mawr College. Her first book, Queer Budapest, 1873 to 1961, was published last year by University of Chicago Press. We also have Jeff Bowersox, who is associate professor at University College London. And one of his many publications is his book titled Raising Germans in the Age of Empire, Youth and Colonial Culture, 1871 to 1914. We have Emily Greble, associate professor at Vanderbilt University. She's written 2 books, one that came out quite recently. Her first book is Sarajevo, 1941 to 1945, Muslims, Christians, and Jews in Hitler's Europe. And her more recent book is Muslims in the Making of Modern Europe. And then we have Danielle Beaujon, who's currently a postdoctoral research associate at the University of Illinois at Chicago. She defended her dissertation in 2021, I believe, and it was titled Controlling the Kasbah, Policing North Africans in Marseille and Algiers, 1920 to 1950. So we're so excited to have all of you here. And I'm going to start by asking you a question about why European history for you? How did you first personally come to an interest in European history? And how has your understanding of what that object called European history means shifted over the course of your career? And if so, how? Who wants to go first?
I'll jump in. Thank you so much, Lauren, and thank you to the Modern Europe History Collective for organizing this event today. So I come to European history as someone trained in East European history. And in that field, the question of what is this object of Europe is fundamental, both to our research and also to our teaching. We sort of begin with the presumption that concepts of Europe are fundamentally exclusionary. And so the question of what is Europe when I teach my courses is always, do we include Russia? Do we include all of it? Does it go to Siberia? What about Azerbaijan? What about Turkey? Personally, I came to the study of Europe sort of in a really roundabout way. My parents loved novels about World War II. And so that's what I grew up reading. And my first time in Europe was a study abroad in Prague. And I was excited to see Czech Republic and Slovakia and Poland and Hungary and Croatia, and had no interest in Paris or Berlin or Madrid or anything that was other people's Europe. I wanted to hike northern Greece, not go to Santorini. And so I think that, part of our approach, or what drew me to the region, was just kind of this personal interest and background of reading a lot of fiction, no family connections, just enjoying it growing up.
Maybe I go second. Thank you for that very interesting introduction, Emily, and also thank you for organizing this webinar. I'm really glad and excited to be part of it. So I actually grew up in Hungary, and it was a very interesting question to me about how did I come to European history? I mean, I guess I lived it, but what's interesting, it was really about when I first came to the US. I came as a student athlete. So I was a big jock. I played tennis, but starting taking classes, I realized that what I understood, and I was, studying European history in Hungary, which was really putting Hungarian history in European trends and thinking through, again, Hungary in the center, through how Europe changed over time and how this little country that back in the day used to be much bigger fit into these larger trends. And when I arrived to the US and taking classes, I was really just shocked that this Western European civilization and like European courses just really did not cover Eastern Europe or East Central Europe, and really focused on the major trend, and really were quite Eurocentric, we could say. And so since I've gotten the privilege to actually be able to teach again, I think I'm actually going back to those roots in the 90s, that when Hungary was in a much different political place, I might add, and really teach Europe from the margins, so to speak, and think about, what Europe looks like, thinking through those both regions, but also themes that historically speaking have not been taught to American students, who always come to my classes at least thinking, oh, they already covered European history. They know what's going on because they've taken these classes in high school. So it's actually very interesting, I find, to really shake the students' understanding what Europe is, what European history is, and I find it really fun. But I leave it there. Thank you.
I'll maybe jump in next, just because I think I came to European history a little bit as that shaken student that Anita just mentioned. So I'm a French historian by training, and I really came to French history through language. I started taking it in high school because my last name is French, and I thought it'd be cool to speak the language that my last name is. And so the history that you get through French language training in the US is so romantic, right? It's all about red wine and the Eiffel Tower and, fraternité, liberté, égalité. And so that's what was sort of my image of France. And then the first time I went to France, I was in an exchange program, sat down at a family dinner table, and the sort of grandfather figure made this offhand racist comment about Algerians. And his granddaughter was apologizing for it later and explaining to me that her grandfather had been a soldier in the Algerian War. And this was a revelation for me, who had really never thought about France as a colonial power in my training in the US, never thought about the Algerian War at all. And so it kind of opened my eyes to this whole other history of France that I had never learned about or thought about in my language training in high school. So that question of the contradictions between the idealized version of France that my language training had brought me to, and the sort of more complex lived reality of France in a contemporary society, really kind of motivated all of my research questions as an undergraduate and graduate student. And so to that extent, how has European history shifted over my career? I think for me, it really has shifted from this very idealistic vision, right, of sort of great white men version of European history that's really all about progress and sort of Europe as this beacon of the way forward, and instead has become a much more layered and complicated history about power relations and marginalized groups. So that, for me, that's how Europe has shifted over the course of my engagement with it.
Great, yeah.
I think my experience is not that different from Danielle's, actually. My own personal experience with my introduction to European history, I suppose, was in high school. And it was literally with the question, how do we define the West? And this is my favorite history teacher. He's one of the main reasons I am a historian today. And he opened his the AP European history class with that question. And being, wanting to be the good student, my hand immediately popped up, and I assumed I knew the answer. And so I very confidently told him, well, it's obviously the geographically westernmost part of the continent of Europe. And then he very kindly corrected me and introduced me to the concept of the West as this sort of monolithic cultural community with this linear historical heritage that dates back to the classical Mediterranean, Plato to NATO. And this was only a few years after the end of the Cold War, so it really was Plato to NATO. And with no Eastern Europe and with no empire. And that's the frame that I fell in love with European history with. And it wasn't really until I went to my postgrad, my master's study, that I was first introduced to post-colonial thinkers, Frantz Fanon in particular. It's the first real critical voice that I had that challenged that idea. And And it was then that I came to understand a different model of what we should understand as European history. And this is what's guided my career since then, which is the idea of Europe not as a place that we can just conclusively define as Europe. Like, as mentioned, I think as Emily mentioned, those borders are not fixed. What we include very much varies. So not as that, but rather as a place that has very fluid boundaries, that's tied into global networks of power, and that those global networks of power constitute that very concept of Europe. And what we understand is that place that we define as Europe in various institutional forms and cultural forms. And so I think, and in fact, this is often how when I teach European history, increasingly, this is what I get students to think about first and foremost. What is Europe? Does it include Britain? I mean, I'm based in London. Does it include Britain or Norway? Does it include Algeria? Does it include Russia? Does it include Martinique, where Frantz Fanon was from, which is constitutionally part of France and the European Union? So these sorts of questions help bring the students into the question of what constitutes Europe. And so I think with this sort of frame in mind, as I was thinking about the question, it occurred to me that in some sense, my professional career has been devoted to taking that high school question and turning it on its head and then picking it apart piece by piece, and helping my students, sort of do the same thing.
Great. I love all those answers. And I also was a language student, story with German in my case. So I very much resonated with that, and realizing that Germany was in fact more than beer and pretzels was an exciting realization for me, and one that I've continued to pursue. So I guess some of you kind of already got to this, but we all do, focus linguistically or for other reasons on particular places and spaces within this continent, or multi-continental space that Europe might be. And I'm curious to know how for you, what does it mean to think in a European frame rather than a national or regional frame? How does your own work and your own focus on France or Hungary or Sarajevo shift when you think of it on a national context or regional context versus a European context? Who wants to go first?
I can go first again, but I feel like we should rotate a little bit. So maybe this time, like we go, maybe this time it starts with Anita, right? And then we come up and back around.
I'll jump in.
Thanks, Jeff.
So for me, thinking in a European frame, I mean, it helps me in two ways. I'm trained as a German historian, and rather traditionally trained as a German national historian, even though my research interest was in German colonial culture, and I now look at Black German, Black European histories, and African-American histories in Europe. But thinking in a European frame helps me to problematize those national frames that we tend to be trained within, institutionally in the way we teach them, and to sort of challenge the idea that we can teach German history without connecting it in some way to these various places that are around it. It forces us to define those national boundaries as porous, not as insignificant, but as porous. And it makes me think about things like population movements. We think of the 1840 revolution, of course, when Paris sneezed, Europe caught a cold, says Metternich. So political events, World War I, yada, yada, we know that already. But when we think about population movements or cultural trends in gender norms and sort of things that flow across boundaries, thinking in a European frame helps us understand that those national local circumstances are important, but aren't necessarily always distinctive. It's the first way. The second way is that it also helps me remember, and this is something that's already been said, so I won't belabor the point, that Europe only really exists relationally to something that's not Europe. And for me, that's not just about imperial frameworks and colonial frameworks, although it is. I study African-American entertainers. And when those entertainers come to Europe in the late 19th century and they're entertaining, they're doubly not European. They're Black and they're American. And those are both presumptions that those things are not European at the time and even today. And so helping us is, if we don't take that frame as given, then we can think about the ways that those assumptions of otherness and foreignness reveal the constructedness of that frame itself. And that frame then affects things that happen at the time and then legacies that last into the present. For example, in the lives of Black Europeans in the present who have long histories of a presence within Europe, centuries and centuries old, that's not widely known. And that fact alone then leads to practices of exclusion, very real practical practice of exclusion in the present, politically, socially, and otherwise. And then also intellectually, just the way we think about disciplines like European history, which is presumed in some sense to be monolithically white, except maybe for the post-war period. But that's not true, not just for the post-war period, but for centuries before that.
Yeah, I guess I'll jump in. I was hesitant to go first because in a way, my answer to this question is that I don't really think in a European framework. I tend to think in an imperial framework. So Jeff, sort of riffing on your answer in a way. But to that extent, so my work thinks in the French Empire context, but you can only, I would argue, understand the motivations of the French Empire if you're also thinking trans-imperially. So comparing it to the motivation, a lot of, I think, imperial decisions in France are made in conversation with and relation to decisions in the British Empire and Germany, Italy, even American Empire. All of these imperial frameworks are really important for understanding sort of what we might define as traditionally national histories. And so I think particularly if you're looking, well, really, I mean, if you're looking from like the 16th century forward, I think you have to consider Europe in a sort of global framework to really understand even really city level politics. My work is very micro local, but to understand the decisions being made in Marseille and Algiers, I really have to look at what's happening on a geopolitical scale at the level of empire.
Anita?
I would just say, wow, amazing answers. And also just, adding to, in terms of through my own work, thinking about women's and gender, particularly queer history, you can't think about these. I think in terms of, I think a European framework is maybe useful in thinking about large change over time, especially if you want to think about how to think, in terms of norms and ideas around sexuality, gender norms change over time, and we want to talk about it for our students. And then I think it's very important to think about, to destabilize this idea that everything comes from, these wonderful great white men who reside in European urban metropolises, right? So I think we can really start thinking about whether it's also through, of course, empires, but also through travel, and very much in my work is thinking through how, what Europe is, and thinking, so decentering, thinking about East Central Europe as also knowledge producers, right? We always associate the West as where ideas are coming from and then disseminated. So I think we can also think about a European framework that is inherently informational. The information would follow in both directions, in every directions, and not only information, but bodies could circulate in every which ways, right? And not only between metropolises across different nations and empires, but also in terms of rural and major cities. And so lastly, but I think it's also in terms of thinking about how we can all bring together. I do think that I love the micro histories, because I think like these, without case studies, then it's all so general, then we lose any specificities and any, in terms of thinking out how and show, and what I find, how to show our students how actually context and location matters, even though all these places are connected. And so then they could really think about how to tell a history of a particular place through the, in my case, queer history. So I think, again, all of these things are needed. And I think, yes, I stop here. Thanks.
This is really interesting. I love hearing your thoughts. And what's fascinating to me is sort of hearing from sort of a French Empire and German sort of and global perspective. I think that it's actually distinct and a different framework of thinking, or a different way of approaching a European frame than those of us who are operating and researching local communities who are kind of considered peripheral to really what operates as a cultural, political, and economic network. So your empires, right, control the narratives and the economies and the legal structures right, of many other regions in Europe. And so even the imperial framework still has a little bit of this kind of hierarchical approach to it in vis-a-vis other parts of Europe that are kind of outside of those imperial frameworks. And I think that kind of starting from the perspective of societies that deeply felt excluded, right, from those economies and from those political systems, and who constantly had their sovereignty undermined, right, offers a different way of thinking about the European frame, whether we're talking about, Crete or Siberia in the 19th century, or Bosnia and Herzegovina today, which is feeling this very much as Europe, quote unquote, comes in and is talking about taking apart their country. And people are wrestling with, the real political, economic, social, cultural implications of that. And so I think for me, thinking in a European frame means adopting a really capacious and inclusive understanding of how far these cultural and political and economic links sort of spread out, and also challenging constructions of European history that seek to limit, right? And this comes back to what Jeff was saying, limits those who are considered part of the European history.
Thank you for those great answers. Just to remind the audience that you can log your questions in the Q&A, and somebody has already logged their question, so I'm going to read it because it picks up directly on some of what you were all just saying. So this is from Jennifer Sessions, who says, thank you so much for putting this panel together. I wanted to pick up on this question of what it means to think in a European as opposed to a national or regional framework. That invited such thoughtful responses from the panelists, and I know that the panel is heavily weighted towards colleagues whose specialties lie in Central and Eastern Europe. Does this suggest something about the relative weight of European frameworks within different national or regional fields? Are historians of Central and Eastern Europe more attuned to Europe than those of us in other fields? Does Europe matter more or differently in those places historically in ways that are now reflected in historians' work? So yeah, this question about I find this an interesting question. Are some national fields more oriented towards Europe than others? And we don't have, Jeff kind of made this interesting point about is Britain part of Europe? We don't currently have a British historian on this panel, but that I imagine a British historian would have a different thing to say about this than a historian based in Budapest or in Sarajevo. But I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on Jennifer's question. Thank you for the excellent question, Jennifer. Danielle.
Yeah. This is kind of also a question for the panelists in a way, but yeah, it strikes me that France never had to prove that it was European, right? That there's this sort of assumption that France is Europe in a way. So then, does that change the stakes, right, historically for sort of more marginalized, peripheral parts of Europe to stake belonging in a way that maybe Belgian historians or French historians or even German historians maybe don't so much have to do.
Does anyone else want it? Emily?
I mean, I was just going to say, I don't think we are lopsided towards Central or toward, Eastern Europe. I mean, I would see Germany as part of the and a German historical tradition, some more similar to France. So I wonder, right? I feel like we kind of represent 4 different corners of Europe, and even the Hungarian experience and Southeastern Europe. I imagine we came at this from very different angles.
Yeah, I mean, I think Germany's never really had to, German historians have never really had to defend whether or not they're European historians. I mean, from the political context over the 20th century, if not going back to the 19th, Germany as great power, Germany as center of the Cold War, Germany as the heart of the European Union. It's, and also just given the centrality of, say, the First and the Second World Wars in the teaching of history, departments just want to have German historians because they can teach those things generally, right? I'm not a historian of the Nazi period. I teach the Nazis, right? Because, that needs to be taught for reasons that are both good and cynical. But that being said, I think there's something really important about and distinctive about these different national histories and the ways in which, as Emily mentioned, the point about which countries sort of historically have been dominant, whether that's in a cultural sense, like say France, or politically, say Germany and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The Habsburgs and the Hohenzollerns governed over so much of Eastern Europe along with the Romanovs in Russia. These are dominant territories that haven't had to justify themselves. And in fact, when the discipline of history was being invented, it was the history of those powerful nations. And that's how you justified your place as a great power. And that was then the tactic that was used by those national movements striving against that domination, whether it's various Pan-Slavs or the Irish, who are trying to say, we have a history too, and our history is national and it's civilized and European. So I think those have been baked into how we think about history, from the way that general textbooks pick topics that are then taught. Why Ukraine never shows up, except unless someone's trying to make a point in a textbook. You don't get stories about Odessa generally, but you get lots of London and Birmingham. You get lots of Berlin. You also don't get the Hungarian countryside. You don't get the German countryside generally. You get the British countryside if it's the enclosure movement. And Britain, and to answer the question about whether Britain should be in this or not, if there was a British historian here, I'd say it depends on where the person is and their politics. If they're in the US, good chance they're within a conception of European history, because there's not often enough space within small departments to have British and European historians. In the UK, probably there's a space within your department to have plenty of British historians, and then their politics on Brexit would then determine how they relate themselves to European history more generally, especially now. Maybe not so true 25 years ago, but certainly true now.
Anita, do you want to speak to this? Or
yes. I mean, just briefly, I think it also very much depends on, we are really just referencing the US and the UK. I mean, there's just much more history that is being taught. So if you ask this question about, this is being taught in elsewhere outside, I think we would have vastly different answers. So I'm just, so I just want to remind us where we are, the situations that it's the US and the UK primary that we're discussing. I think it would look very differently.
Great. Well, I'm pleased to report that a British historian has entered the chat. So this is a question from James Vernon. Thanks. I am really enjoying this conversation. I am a historian of Britain and one that has to go teach shortly, but I am interested in this question of what is Europe and who counts as part of it. Many of the panelists are suggesting we have to teach Europe from the outside in as an imperial and global formation. I agree, but it begs the question of what is Europe? What is this object you keep invoking? So if anyone would like to pin down Europe.
Such a small question, right?
Right.
I mean, just to follow on Jeff's, everyone's point, if you think of Europe as a contested, also invented, era culturally and as well as geographically contested and constantly fluid, I think it's an interesting question we can pose, depending on the time period we study, right? Europe could look very differently in the 16th or 17th century as in the 20th or during the Cold War, right? So I think if the premise is to, again, give agency to our students, as well, then we could really, I think it's a great intellectual exercise to actually think about it. Like, what do we mean by Europe in the turn of the 20th century? How can we come up with a working definition with the help of us as supposedly experts, but also the students bring in amazing insights, and they actually are perfectly capable of coming up with a working definition that we can use both in terms of geographically speaking, culturally, as well as politically speaking. And of course, this could include the imperial borders as well.
Yeah, I just build on that, I guess. I would argue that Europe is every bit as much an imagined community as any nation state formation, right? And so we have to think about Europe as being a collection of a collective imaginary, right? And so in any time period, Europe is being constructed against something else by those who consider themselves to be European or those who would aspire to define themselves as European. And so this is why I think, in fact, the imperial framework is so imperative. And so much of imperial hierarchy is about defining what is European for the sake of proving that the imperial holdings are not European. But we could even look at a different time period. I think, since a British historian asked the question of is Britain part of Europe, looks really different depending on what period of British history you're looking at as well, and what the stakes are of claiming Europeanness. So, I think that the point is that the object of Europe is not really something we can define, and that, in my opinion, what's interesting about it is the contestations.
I'd agree with that point entirely. And I'd only build on it by saying that this it's precisely, Europe is precisely what people say it is. And it's not what they say it isn't. It's just that they don't all agree necessarily. And it's exploring how they argue about it. That's the part that's interesting to me. And I think for the British context, this became most apparent to me when I first came to the UK, which is in 2012. And when I first started teaching, which is in 2013, having been in the US for a number of years. And obviously I'm American, but trained in Canada. And I started off a European history class at the University of Worcester in a discussion group, just talking about what we were going to cover. And when I happened to mention that Britain was going to be included in the class, a number of the students protested. And I didn't understand why they were protesting. And this is before the Brexit votes, but still within the sort of Eurosceptic discussions. And I literally didn't understand how they could think of Britain not as part of Europe. And yet, of course, in a certain respect with the political stakes, they're right, even if I disagree with the political context of this, but they're not wrong. This is a contestation. And I think it's not just about, I think there is a danger in thinking that we have to think of Europe within imperial and global frames. And that's the only relevant frame of analysis, which I don't think is true. It's the one that I use. But these also work internally as well to look at the differentiation across different parts of Europe and the way that an idea of Europe can then be used to justify various sorts of projects or exclusions based on the Hungarian countryside, say, which I know from German textbooks of the late 19th century is defined as every bit as uncivilized as parts of colonial territories, far away geographically from the continent. So I think that those frames aren't necessarily incompatible, and there's nothing wrong with doing the internal analysis of that. I would say those ideas of differentiation are the key to understanding how contemporaries understood Europe and how they then use those understandings to do things. And that's the thing that I'm most interested in, the argument, and then the way those arguments justify uses and actions based on those.
I'd just like to add, as someone who just wrote a book called Muslims in the Making of Modern Europe, that I echo what you guys are saying about the construction and how this is a sort of slippery idea and the object changes. But the ways that the object of Europe changes is often deeply grounded in sort of racist and Islamophobic narratives. And, the fact that Ottoman history has been written sort of out of a lot of European history is really weird to me. The Ottoman Empire was a European empire, and very few Europeanists teach it or understand it or read about it. And it often gets sort of shifted and relegated into the world of Middle East history exclusively. I often will say in talks or to my students, like, why is Bosnia considered Middle East, right, until the Austro-Hungarians are ruling it, right? So what does that tell us about the ways that we're understanding this object of Europe and how we're defining it? Because I think that we have created, especially around Southeastern Europe and the Ottoman Empire, these really rigid boundaries that sort of indicate or suggest that Muslim societies are inherently not European. And I just, part of my hope is that we can counter that.
Yeah, I would just to jump on that. I feel like in reverse with North Africa, there's a sort of claiming of ancient Egypt, ancient Roman North Africa as European, and then a rejection centuries later of the idea of North Africa as part of Europe. So there's this kind of cherry picking of European history that goes on that I completely agree is related to this history of racism and Islamophobia.
Yeah, and the way that Plato to NATO narrative sort of migrates north of the Mediterranean and then stops, even though that sort of era between classical and Renaissance all of that classical learning is being cultivated, developed, expanded upon in the Islamic world. And that's where the Renaissance ideas in Latin Christendom, that's where they're getting these ideas back, rediscovering the ideas that hadn't ever been lost. They were just over there. And that's part of that. And that gets then reproduced within history curricula in Britain, for example, when they sort of, the curriculum emphasizes that linear narrative where you get from Rome and you jump to the Renaissance. And then the Islamic world, say the Abbasid Caliphate, that only can be taught within an example that contrasts with the development of contemporary Europe. It's not even possible to integrate it within the curriculum into this part, where there's a broader cultural exchange and interaction going on, much less talking about what's happening within the Iberian Peninsula in this very period, which is also part of Europe.
Great. We're getting some questions in the chat that I want to bring onto the discussion as well. So several people have said that this is a fascinating discussion. Nazreen Rahal makes the point that I feel like as Europe developed, ideas of exclusion emerged, and picking up on something Emily said, this is definitely the case with the way we talk about Muslims in Europe. Danielle and Emily's work both touched on this topic. Sterkar has a really interesting question, which is, do we even need Europe at all times? Are there times when we might? Is the European framework always relevant? For instance, does it not make more sense to have Mediterranean as our framework when we are talking about certain periods or certain topics? So I'll throw that question out and then, ask whether there's times when we want to reject the European framework together. No European history, not now, would I guess then be the thing, but yeah.
I guess I'll just say quickly, my work focuses, I do micro histories of Marseille and Algiers, and yes, my framework is Mediterranean, right? I'm thinking about this as a Mediterranean space, kind of more so than I'm thinking about it as a European space. But like I said, I think for me to understand these micro local communities, I have to also understand national, European, global frameworks, especially because I'm working around the period of World War II, and there's a lot that happens in the Mediterranean that relates to much broader frameworks. So, we don't always need Europe. It's maybe not always the framework that's going to make sense. But I think there's still ways in which it's important to be attentive to larger frameworks as you're talking about much more specific geographies.
Does anyone else want to weigh in on that, or should I take another question from the chat?
I think I'd add an example that relates to this as well. And it's building on Danielle's point about regional frames, or we could even talk about thematic frames being more relevant than a geographic frame. Setting aside the sort of institutional dynamics within history departments and how history classes are sold, and setting that aside for a moment. But you could also think of classes that are, or research projects that are about urban experiences, for example. And in that model, Chicago and Berlin have a lot more in common than does Berlin and the Thuringian countryside, or does, perhaps an older city like London and a newer city like Berlin. In those things, Europe isn't irrelevant, because Berliners certainly think of themselves as European, and Chicagoans certainly think of themselves as American, although there's lots of cross back and forth with migrants. So Europe isn't irrelevant, but it's not the mainframe. And so it's sort of an element that can help understand the specificity of those interactions and differences, but doesn't have to be the frame. And in those cases, I would say we don't need Europe very much. In those contexts, I can always ask, it just depends on the question you're trying to answer, I think.
Great. There's a lot of great questions here. I'll take one to Jeff asked us to set aside courses for a moment, but I will ask us to put them back on the burner. So we have a couple of questions here, both about teaching, and maybe I'll get to that in a second, but then also about the jobs crisis in terms of stable, permanent jobs in history departments. So we know that good jobs in history departments are shrinking. And at least in the US, and we can be specific about our context here, but at least in the US, we know jobs in European history are shrinking even faster than the overall number of tenure track jobs in history. According to the AHA 2021 jobs report, In 2015, European positions made up 15% of all job postings, and last year they fell to just 7%, a total of just 38 jobs. Departments that used to have multiple people responsible for covering European history now have one. In other departments, European historians are hired actually as world historians or under other kinds of methodological rubrics, whether that be environment, gender, migration, what have you. What are the implications of these facts for how we do European history? And then to pick up on a question that Stephen Siegel has, is, are panelists optimistic about making European history territorially relevant into the mid-2020s? And what does it look like for early career historians and multidisciplinary postdocs, PhD candidates coming out of our ones and elsewhere? What do you think are the growth fields for Europeanists now?
So Lauren, I think there's two things going on here, right? I mean, the first is this really big question about sort of the loss of tenure track positions and the dire, job market, which, is not just in the US. There's also less jobs in the UK, and, Germany has been experiencing this for quite some time. And kind of, I think we're also seeing a devaluation of the teacher scholar role, right? And kind of a shift at some universities to just the teacher role, as opposed to kind of really supporting teacher scholar positions with sort of the tenure kind of system and research funds. And I think that connected to that are questions of equity and training more graduate students and all of that. But I want to put that aside for a second, because I think that's kind of beyond this particular roundtable, but we can come back to it if anyone wants to. But I think that, the other question is, how does one sort of think about teaching and positioning oneself in the market that does exist? And what does that look like? And here, I think actually those of us who have worked on sort of peripheral regions have some experience, because I sometimes am a little amused when someone will say, oh my God, there's no jobs in French history, or there's no jobs in German history. Like, guess what? There has never been a job in Yugoslav history, right? Since I started applying to jobs in like 2008, I don't think there was ever a job in Finnish history or Portuguese history or Georgian history. And yet there's lots of really great historians who work on these places, who have made their way in academia, including in difficult job markets. This market is certainly more difficult than other moments, but we have had recessions in the past. And I think here, kind of looking to our colleagues in Middle East history and Latin American history and African history and Asian history, who have often been the only faculty member in departments, for generations, and have been responsible for teaching broadly, can be really helpful in the way that we kind of think about our research and also about our courses. When I got hired in my first tenure track job, I was responsible in my very first semester for teaching Ottoman, Prussian, Habsburg, and Russian history. I did a comparative empire course. I also taught a course on post-communism from 89 to the present, that was also supposed to be political science, that had 13 countries, right? None of us are trained in all of this, but if we look at kind of our colleagues and how they are structured and shaped classes, we can actually make a real effort to teach a more inclusive Europe. And some of that is asking questions like, do we include this or do we not? And others is just including it, right? And make, we're in charge, and making the statement that I'm going to learn about, how law operated in Denmark, because I'm interested in law and that's important to me. And it's also important for me to understand how it, works in Crimea, right? And these are all part of a European conversation. That was a little bit long-winded.
I think that was amazing. Oh, I was just going to say that, I think, yes, Emily said, there's two things. One is about, are we talking about potential advice or like what to think about for, graduate students who are and coming up, and also people in postdoctoral positions of trying to find jobs. And the other one is like, what do we do when we are the sole Europeanist supposedly teaching the next generation of American or UK citizens to be global citizens who understand the history of Europe. Wow, small things to carry. But in terms of the first one, I would say, I mean, I would just second Emily's points about it's actually, I think it's similar to, you know, Hungarian historians we haven't gotten a lot of jobs, but also I think it's actually been beneficial in thinking about, you know, we always had to think about larger trends. We always had to speak to, we also always had to be comparative. We always had to be thinking about how does our histories speak to the existing, which tended to be Western German, British, French, existing histories on our subject matters, right? And so we would make an argument about, oh, this is how it speaks. And I think in and of itself, that argument actually is incredibly helpful to showcase not only you can do comparative, transnational, but you also wear and you can teach a lot of other histories that often it's assumed. And of course, it's not true that, again, we've seen in the case of Jeff and Danielle that of course they could be teaching European histories, but sometimes there's also an assumption that if you're coming from a country that, or a regional focus that is inherently being on the periphery, you'll be able to teach actually much, broader than people who just been focusing in the so-called national like histories who've been established. But I think that it speaks a lot about, you know, this focus on actually, intersectionality and interdisciplinarity. I think it's been, you know, these are hard things that are big catchy words, but I do think most of us are doing interdisciplinary work. And I also think that having to think through how you can connect to area studies and how you can expand the ways in which you are more marketable and, you know, your stuff speaks to a lot of the, I think, the job ads that might not be in the fields of necessarily even history. And then the last thing, I'm just in terms of teaching, I think it's, again, I would just echo what Emily was saying in terms of, I mean, I think we have to be, you know, we have a mandate. I think we can use that to teach interesting things. At the same time, I do think we also have a responsibility to cover these large change over time and give the students a sense of excitement and also some, you know, background and excitement in terms of these, I feel like case studies or contacts that then can spark their interest, and then they can go to area studies or seek people out in the specific, you know, places that they could learn something about Sarajevo or learn something about Denmark or, you know, some Martinique or, you know, so I think it's also falls on our shoulder, but I think it's part of our responsibility. Okay, stop here.
Yeah, and I guess in some ways, this conversation to me, as a recent PhD, with lots of Americanist colleagues in grad school, there's very similar conversations happening with American history, the sort of lament of the disappearance of the Americanist job. But then if you look at job postings, there are in fact African-American jobs and Latinx jobs and Asian Pacific Islander jobs that are still about the US and are still American history. And I would make roughly the same argument for Europe that yes, there are fewer European history jobs as such, but there are jobs, and there are fewer jobs in general that I'm very much aware of. But there are ways in which there are other jobs out there that Europeanists certainly qualify for if we rethink how we're defining ourselves. And I say that as someone who, for example, my position here is as a postdoc, but I'll be joining as an assistant professor in the Department of Criminology, Law, and Justice. So I'm a historian of policing in the French Empire. And so my work connects to other geographies and other disciplines who are also interested in questions of law and policing and criminality. And I think in some ways, thinking broadly like that allows you not just to reframe where you're applying for jobs, although it certainly does that, but it also allows you to reframe how you're conceptualizing your work, what literatures you're grounding yourself in. I think it's, for me, been really intellectually invigorating to have to rethink of, who I am, not just as a French historian, but in several other lenses. In a way, I think it's fair for the job market to ask us to do more, in the same way that it's asking Americanists to be and do more. I think Europeanists should also be heeding that call.
I only have one small thing to add, because that was all excellent and I agree wholeheartedly. The only thing that I would add is that the implications of this, and maybe this would be something for further discussion, especially for those based in the US, which I'm not, is how does that then affect how we train PhD students? Because the implication of that, and certainly the way I think about this as well, is that PhD students need to not be thinking about this as they're about to submit, right? This has to be built into the beginning of the training. And in the US, in North America, I should say, the system is built around the idea that you get lots of exposure to different sorts of classes. And that in the UK, that isn't the case. But in North America, that is the case. So there's ability to build in a structure that can expose people to different sorts of perspectives or provide a range of opportunities. And at least in my training, that wasn't entirely, it wasn't encouraged to do so. It was available, but it wasn't encouraged. I mean, I don't know, that was, that was however long ago, 10, 15, 20 years ago. I don't know if that's different now or not, but perhaps it should be if it's not different.
Well, I think here actually, Jeff, this is one of those places where, again, sort of those of us who were trained outside of a nation state framework, like, East European study, right, where our oral and qualifying exams, you're responsible for the historiographies of 14 countries. And, the lists are a couple hundred books, and, your side fields are, right, per empires that are on either side. So if you're working on Poland, you might be doing, a field in Russian history, Imperial Russia or Soviet, right? And so I do think that the training needs to be more expansive, and there needs to be a presumption in one's research and writing, and as well as one's teaching, that you need to communicate to people outside of a nation state framework. And that you have to be able to think about your work sort of looking outward, whether that's in the imperial framework, whether that's in a global framework, whether that's, an environmental studies framework, a gender framework, right? Whatever it might be for you, a legal history framework, economic history. I mean, we're seeing all of these things, but the framework has to be bigger than a particular nation state, because that sort of model of training, I think, in Europe is just not as it's not as lucrative, if what you're looking for is job market and long-term career prospects in academia.
Great. We do have a couple of questions about teaching specifically, so I'll combine two of them, and you can each pick up what you want to. And this, I think, picks up on what we were just saying. So Pierre Purcell says, thanks for this great panel and fascinating conversation. I'd love to know how you think we should train the next generation of historians of Europe. So some of you have already spoken to this, but if you want to speak to this further, you can. And he asks, how do you help grad students reconcile the fragmented nature of the European experience with the attempt to provide an integrated narrative or interpretive framework? And how do you make the case for modern European history as a field, if you, in fact, make the case for modern European history as a field? And I think we've just heard some arguments for maybe not doing that. And then I think Mary Lewis has an excellent question that asks us to be very concrete. So let's talk about how you frame your courses. What are your organizing principles, chronologies, geographies? What are the biggest draws that you personally teach? And I'd be very curious to hear about that. I will say one class, just as another European historian, one class that filled up immediately as soon as I announced it was one on Mediterranean migrations that went back. I'm trained as a Germanist, but teaching about the Mediterranean as a space got a lot of students into my courses who told me to my face that they would never have taken a European history course, but they were interested in Mediterranean migrations. So that was an example where shifting my frame from the Europe to the Mediterranean brought in a lot of students who didn't think they were interested in European history, but told me that Europe was more interesting than they had expected. But I'll let you take it away now.
I'll go, because I have very similar experiences at, Bryn, very progressive students, where they see Europe as a colonizer and they see anything European as basically Eurocentric, and it's just imperial and something that we want to stomp upon and like reframe and we don't even want to know more about, basically. So in terms of thinking about drawing them in, I think, definitely the idea of Europe from the margins. So that we have courses that really thinking about and explicitly, stating that we are going to rethink the assumptions and the historical frameworks of European history and European studies. And actually, this is an interdisciplinary. I do it with a political scientist and a German film scholar. So we all offer different courses to do that. And I do this through history of sexuality. So the other one I do as the only European historian, I actually don't do these chronological courses that are just, Europe from the 19th century or modern European history. I actually do thematic courses. So whether it's the history of human rights, whether it's a history of sexuality, whether it's history of gender, I look through a specific theme, and then of course it's changed over time and it's largely chronological, but I think so the students do get some of the main standard political change over time that we would, but then we would also really through the specific examples, whether it's sexuality or gender or human rights, really put test and actually really contest and actually historicize why certain events become associated with this, what we earlier said, this, this progressive narrative that we associate with the rise of the West, right? So, but I think there are a lot of different ways of doing it. But again, history of gender and sexuality, human rights, like themes that I think will resonate with our student body at Bryn Mawr. Bring them in, even though, often Europe has to be in the title. All right, let's stop there.
I tend to teach I'm in two departments. So one of my departments is history and the other is in Russian and East European studies. And so the kinds of courses that I'm responsible for are different in each. And on the history side, I tend to teach courses from the perspective of minorities in Europe. So themes like law and rights in Europe, which try to encompass, all different case studies. I teach a large lecture on Muslims in modern Europe, which covers Britain and also Russia and Southeastern Europe. And Germany, and tries to use Muslim sources from Europe to sort of retell Europe's grand narrative. So what does World War I look like from the perspective of the POWs that are in the camp outside of Berlin at the time of the first mosque, and not what does World War I look like, from the perspective of the German army, right? So those kinds of things. On the other side, then, the East European stuff is, it's sort of required to be very much grounded in a regional perspective, but there, I also try to really integrate the Caucasus and Central Asia and sort of push boundaries of even what we think of as, Eastern Europe, and where that category as a distinct category goes.
I'm similarly multiply placed in the sense that I'm a historian, but I'm actually in a languages school. So there are historians within the school. It's quite interdisciplinary. But most of my students are not history students. And because we have a German program, most of my teaching is in German specific classes. So I don't get to teach as much Europe as I used to. When I did at the University of Southern Mississippi, then I did teach those big narrative classes. And I think that the effort to try to find examples that are outside of the Germany, Britain, France model, or Russia popping up when it's a great power conflict, or the Russian Revolution, or Austria disappearing again after 1914, like trying to make sure that those examples get back in, that we talk about Spain when we talk about liberalism in the late 18th, early 19th century, that we talk about Eastern Europe when we talk about human mobility, and we talk about themes like human mobility. And so I think you can, and because I think as, someone said earlier, sorry, who was it? Sorry, maybe it was Anita said it earlier, but making sure that we pay attention to the need for those broad narratives and the idea of getting excited about those stories and giving the historical background that then gives the students the ability to do more stuff in depth. I think that's important. But we can also be very explicit about how we're framing those narratives. As I think has already been said, making sure that they know that this is a constructed story, that it's emphasizing particular themes, and there are other ways to tell this story, and that there are implications for how we tell this story. You don't have to belabor the point for hours and hours every semester, but you can keep it in the front of their mind so that they're aware of the constructedness of this. And then you can also focus, as Emily's already said very well, on those sorts of stories from the margins in all kinds of ways, because they always problematize those concepts at the heart of the teaching.
I guess just really quickly, as someone who, I don't teach any European history, my teaching is purely thematic, so it's a very different position. But I mean, thinking more from the teaching side of things, how do we teach graduate students? What does that look like? I think in part, from my very recent experience, one thing that would be really useful is rethinking the qualifying exam. So what do we want them, what purpose do we want qualifying exams to serve? Are they for teaching? Are they for broad knowledge of a specific geography, of a specific region, of a specific theme? And I think in part, by rethinking what we want the qualifying exam to do, we can set those up, like you said, really early on in the program to have students be thinking outside of just a European framework, to be thinking thematically too, or perhaps interdisciplinarily. And I think by the nature of the job market, any PhD student I know is trying to think of themselves in multiple lenses. And so the more that you as an advisor with PhD students can be thinking with them in multiple lenses, the more we can support students in thinking of their work in multiple frameworks, the better it'll be. Because I do think Europe, I saw this in a question in the chat of, does Europe matter at all? I think it does. I think there's a way in which European history allows us to talk about really interconnected global histories. And that's my perspective, right? That's my bias. I'm a colonial historian, I teach global classes, but Europe is actually a really useful way into these sorts of history, like really expansive global histories. Europe as an empire can be a good way into doing that. So I think Europe can be really useful. Just we have to also think about it, right, not as a given, but as this whole conversation has been doing, as a sort of problematic and problematized space.
And if I could add one final point on what Danielle's just said, we can also, I think about what Chakrabarty asked us to do quite a long time ago, which is to provincialize Europe. And in this case, we don't have to be apologetic about being European historians or even being Eurocentric in our analyses. If you assume that Europe is the model, the standard that you work from, that doesn't work. But the idea that we focus on Europe is not a bad thing, because Europe mattered, just like other parts of the world mattered, but it mattered very particularly because European empires have been so powerful and concepts of Europe have shaped things all around the world. And that is important to understand where those have come from. Their constructedness is really important to understand so that we don't take them for granted. That's important politically in the present, as well as methodologically for historians. Understanding the specificity of what happens in Europe and being able to relate it to what happens in other parts of the world at different times is really important, precisely to show the constructedness, the specificity, and to draw those comparative analyses and understand how they're connected in various ways with notions of power.
Anita?
And I would just also carefully say, and I don't even know, I see it's not a fully formed thought, so I have to be thinking about, but there's something to be said in the current political moment. I feel like I think talking about established European narratives to the students and destabilize them for them, and talking about how, like, show them how these Eurocentric narratives were constructed, and then allow them through introducing the margins, different experiences, different geographies and frameworks for what Europe is, to rethink their own histories and the histories where they come from. And I think it's easier than through you doing American histories, which are so fraught. So I think it's actually, we also, in terms of, we have a responsibility of actually providing tools to students to rethink, by showing them how histories are written and the power that knowledge and histories are embodying, how to rethink rewriting histories and these narratives that are dominating their own lives. So I think, again, I think Europe offers a really good teaching tool. And I would, along the lines of Jeff and everyone else, I think European history does matter. It has mattered for so many different reasons, but also I think it is a very, good place where we could bring in some tools for them to have as students and as again, global citizens going forward to be critical and also analytical in understanding how histories function and how history has been written.
Great. I love all these questions, and I want to bring in a couple more from the chat. Oh, there's some new ones from the chat. Great. But one thing we've all kind of stressed here, and I really like the way that several of you talked about it, was this thematic teaching and teaching comparatively, and teaching. Some of these classes sound just great, and I'd love to take them. This does bring up a question of periodization, right? And Andrew Denning has a question. How does our discussion of the European framework in the modern era define, either implicitly or explicitly, our periodization of those eras deemed important to research or teach? So that's a question about periodization. Jana Schmidt also has a question that I'll bring in here, which is, what about Europe as a philosophical idea, a concept of reason, self-criticism, universality, freedom, equality, human rights, democracy, and openness? What are the potential limits of this idea and how do we think about it given its contestation? I think the idea of Europe, or Europe as an imaginary construct, is intimately tied to the Enlightenment. Does this idea still have a value in the field? So yeah, we're all, I think, located in the late 19th and 20th centuries, but this question of periodization is one I'd like to throw up.
Maybe I could jump in as a sort of modernist who dabbles in earlier periods, because of my teaching and my increasingly my research agenda on Black German and Black European histories. I teach modules in which this is by definition not a modern history. These are massive modules that date back they cover 1,000 years of history, and because I've had to find out more about the Middle Ages, for example, to understand iconography. Why are there Black saints and Black holy figures within German and Christian iconography in the Middle Ages? How do we understand the movements of Africans and their descendants, both within and entirely independent from the transatlantic slave trade? And how do these communities get set up and then become established in ways that contradict the ways we understand the present day notions of race and otherness, right? How do we understand ideas of human difference? As was mentioned earlier, it hasn't always been about race. Religion has been the primary definition of what counts as the us, however you define us, right? Within Latin Christendom, for example, in the Middle Ages. And I think that it's valuable to continue to think about European frames as long as we're not too particular about them. And to be explicit about the sorts of ways we're defining that community, whether it be Latin Christendom, shorthand Europe, but know that that's not actually Europe. And then keep that in mind, I think importantly, because if we think about the way that the world was differently organized, or way these same territories were differently organized 500 or 1,000 years ago, they help us understand that our contemporary definition of how society should be operating isn't necessarily inherent, natural, inevitable. It can change. And I think that's an incredibly empowering idea. And if you can take that idea and attach it to various sorts of principles, maybe derived from the Enlightenment, however problematic the Enlightenment itself was as a historical process, then that can be inspiring. And students have suggested this, that gives them a new way of thinking about how to operate within society in the present and how history helps inform that. I don't know if that quite answers the periodization question entirely, but it does suggest the importance of not limiting our discussion of Europe to a very modern definition, which is based on the ideas of the 19th century and nationalism and capitalism and so on, because there are earlier definitions of community that defined the same space and that help us understand those processes of engagement with difference.
Yeah, I think that's a great answer. And I wanted to also sort of say that I think that we can kind of get at this with sort of a very thoughtful starting point to a course, right? And saying, I'm starting here because of these reasons. And, we're all modern Europeanists. This is the Modern European History Collective, right? So we've all been, and whether we are thinking about modern Europe in terms of law or economy and capital, right? We come at it, we've learned modern Europe begins at this particular moment. And I think for me, I do try to go into I've also keep moving backward in time. in a lot of my research, but also in my courses, to try to sort of give foundational work, right? And that can be really tricky. We're not, trained in it. It's another layer of expansion. But in courses on human rights, to start by teaching what were concepts of tolerance, right, and how did that look in different early modern empires. And I saw John Connolly had a question in the chat about sort of feudalism, and I think that's a great question. And the feudalist structures of sort of what we consider today Western or Central Europe, right, and how that's different from what's in Russia or the Ottoman Empire. I just wanted to throw out that just this week, I was reading these sources from the 1830s and 1820s in Serbia, which is a totally new period for me, and they are so hard. And one of the things I'm trying to get at is this question of slavery, right? And where Ottoman slaves are and who the Christian slaves are and what their understanding as political authority. And I started to realize that the term for slave is being used interchangeably with the term for serf in local sort of early pre-language reform documents. And that is actually really interesting because it also speaks to the sort of in the modern period, the ways that some of these sort of pre-modern structures and systems are being kind of integrated. And perhaps if we do pay more attention to those earlier periods, we'll be able to make better sense of then where it's going, right?
Yeah, I'll just jump in to say that I think the question about the Enlightenment and sort of are there sort of useful values or frameworks from this sort of grand European narrative that we want to maybe salvage or something. It kind of gets me back to the comment you just made, Anita, about Europe as a useful tool for critique. I think using the Enlightenment to sort of, when we teach the Enlightenment, it's equally important to also teach our students that the values espoused by the Enlightenment were never realized, right? And so I think, of course, of Charles Mills's The Racial Contract, and looking at how all of these Enlightenment ideals were in fact foundationally based upon racialized slavery and the exclusion of certain categories from the sorts of rights that this moment was defining. So I think this is useful because it allows us to, yes, find the good and keep the good, but also place it in a historical context that allows us to say that, these, and this is useful for the American context too, for thinking about sort of foundational documents, that it's useful to think about these things with critique and to think about how we can change and adapt them in a modern era. So, again, are there sort of European frameworks that are really important to us? Yes, I would argue for sure that there are, but I think that when we teach them and that when we use them in our scholarship, it's always important to contextualize and critique them rather than taking them as a granted that we should celebrate.
Yeah, I love that point, Danielle, and it reminds me of something Anita said earlier about how her students think that Eurocentric is like a bad term. And I know some of mine are very much the same way. And sometimes when I teach like a global migration history class, they'll just think like an argument for their paper can be, this is Eurocentric. And I love that idea. And I'm like, yes, but you need a second clause here. And I love that idea of kind of using Europe as critique. We have to have a second part to that thesis statement when we're writing an undergrad paper, but also perhaps in our work more broadly. Yes, and Emily spoke to John Connolly's point, which I think also goes back to this periodization point. John Connolly writes, what about the feudal heritage of society of orders with institutionalized rights inhering in corporations and status groups? This goes back to the post-Western imperial predicament of establishing order, so the 5th and 6th centuries. And that story is difficult, but not impossible to relate to Russia as well as the former Ottoman regions. So another great point about how periodization, looking back at the 5th and 6th centuries, asks a different set of questions than the Enlightenment. Great, I have 2 more questions, which is probably just about perfect for 15 minutes left. I think you've all given, I'll start with Andreas Guidi's question. So thanks for this very inspiring panel. Since Lauren, that's me, mentioned Mediterranean migration, how can a European history beyond the nation state And beyond a Western European focus, the Britain, France, Germany, Trinity we've spoken of, critically engage with the increasing militarization of EU borders, especially when discussing with students in class in the East and the South, and also with the way current authoritarian conservative forces use the trope of Europe next to their respective nationalist motives to exclude or stigmatize migrants. Could we hear that?
I mean, I'll just go in terms of, I think I'm teaching just in terms of history of sexuality, and also I'm teaching of the history of fascism then and now. So I think it's, again, thinking about militarization, and then also teaching a course on nationalism and socialism as in East Central Europe. So I think anyone who's been discussing, using these principles of broadening the geography would have talked about places like Ukraine and interwar Europe and post-World War II Europe, knowing about the kind of that again, World War I didn't stop. In half of Europe in 1918 and 1919. So I think if we are teaching Europe in a broad framework and also incorporating a periphery, I think students would have understood that the violence, that post-war violence was very much present, and that what happened in Ukraine in 2015, it didn't just fall out of nowhere, but then also in terms of what is happening in Belarus right now. And so it's a history. So we can contextualize that. I think in any of our European histories, if we are tuned into these much longer trends and historical origins where these come from. But the other thing in terms of the far right, and contemporary far right regimes, use of this idea of Christendom and the defense of Europe as a Christian community. Again, it has very interesting historical origins. You can teach a class on this, of course, that it goes back, of course, in the case of Hungary, again, the writing of national histories and using the Ottoman Empire as the ultimate other, and framing Hungary as and then of course now Poland as the bastion of Western civilization, right? That goes back into history. But of course, in today's context, we can talk about, a very interesting ways in which you can get at this is think of the position of queers or LGBT communities in the Western European countries and within the EU, and then the Eastern European countries, where in the West, of course, it's part of homo-nationalism. They are part of, they are used against othering the Muslim immigrants, versus in the East, they are also used as others in order to further other what they frame as, of course, migrants and not refugees from the Middle East, and in doing so, make these Christian nations, as of Poland and Hungary, as again the bastion of this supposedly Western civilization, of which, of course, never existed. So I just stop there.
Yeah, I guess this picks up on a lot of what Anita was already just saying, but in terms of thinking about contemporary far-right and nationalist parties throughout Europe, and it really is throughout anything we might define as Europe these days, from my context for France, so much of the rhetoric is about this idea of essentialized Frenchness. And what I think is really useful, and particularly the work of Jeff and Emily would speak to this, but my own work in OA too is talking about how is basically breaking apart these ideas of essentialized Frenchness or Britishness or Europeanness in any sort of way, right? That pointing to, in my own work, we can't understand the French Revolution, I would argue, without also looking at the Haitian Revolution. And so by kind of putting in historical context, bringing other voices and other groups into what we think about and talk about as European history, this kind of helps to pull apart the claims being made of essential Europeanness.
And that's a really, really important point. And it makes me think of recent controversies, at least here in Britain in the last number of years, where Mary Beard, for example, the well-known classical historian and television celebrity, fell into a massive Twitter storm because she defended the inclusion of a Black Roman officer within a BBC education film. And that was within the context of a couple other very much smaller controversies, but similar in nature, where a relatively uncontroversial academic point that then found its way into the public sphere provoked massive blowback, especially for female scholars and female scholars of color, in the process revealing how fragile this sort of notion of essential identity actually is for a significant percentage of not just the far right, but also the not so far right. And that drawing attention to those things can help us understand both the sort of historical fallacies that underlie these and their relevance in the present moment. And we can also draw attention to questions, to very specific historical themes, like the histories of mobility and migration. We can look at, to draw from my own teaching, we can talk about migration in Germany, in the German lands in the late 19th century. Germans going out, Germans moving around within the German lands, the fact that there are Austrians and Italians all over Germany in the 1890s, just as there are in the 1990s, the fact that there are Poles all over Germany and that Poles are denigrated and attacked, also politically organized and self-organizing in a way that challenges the existing political system within the new German state. That's not the same thing. It's not history repeating itself in the 1990s and since, but as someone said, it does rhyme. It's a very similar sort of process that helps us understand that this isn't a sudden unprecedented challenge. It's a thing that keeps happening. And we need to understand that it keeps happening to help us understand the inhumanity of the actions in the present.
I'll just add to that coming back to the kind of original question, and I missed the early part of this because for some reason my sound went out or I couldn't hear anything. But when we hear about, as Anita was saying, with Hungary being the boundary of Christendom, or if we are reading some of the press right now about the border between Belarus and Poland, right, and some of the rhetoric that's coming out of Poland about defending Europe. I think that, a lot of these narratives are sort of grounded in these myths of European history. And while, not all historians are comfortable making statements about contemporary politics or sort of weighing in on what we think should be happening in different places, we are usually quite comfortable in saying these are kind of fictional narratives that are being utilized. And I think we have a role there to kind of draw attention to those fictions and to help put them into a longer context. And as Jeff was saying, to be able to show that, those kinds of narratives, right, are not necessarily new. A lot of the same, rhetoric and language, was being used in interwar Paris, as we know, by French police officers. And we know that it was also used at different moments as sort of the Hungarian national movement in the 19th century was sort of defining itself, or as the Serbian national movement was emerging, it was in a way that was trying to create these boundaries of who should be here and who should not. And so the histories of both the boundaries, to come back to our earlier kind of question on what is this object of Europe, the boundaries of Europe were very much tied to the people moving in and out of it. And who's included as Europeans, as well as what is Europe.
Yeah, I'm the moderator, but I'll take this prerogative to say something, which was about the Mediterranean border. I'm currently preparing a class to teach next term that's going to have a mini unit on the US-Mexico border alongside a mini unit on the Mediterranean border. And I'm mentioning this in part because we haven't talked about languages and kind of what languages do our undergrads come in our classrooms with and our graduate students, but a lot of my students are coming in with Spanish. And I've had a lot of success saying, because I teach in the US in the early 21st century, and that's the one foreign language their high school taught in most cases. And so I've had a lot of success getting students to read Spanish sources and having them work a little bit with primary texts, and Spain is a very good place to look at the Mediterranean border regime. So I've been trying to put more Spain in all of my courses because I have more students who can do that linguistically than I do students who can do a lot of other things that I was traditionally teaching increasingly. I don't know if that's an answer. Okay, so we only have 4 minutes left. So you've all given beautiful responses to this question already, I think, but I'll ask you to sum up in your last 4 minutes, so a minute apiece. And this is a really crucial question for all of us. In a time of shrinking resources, what arguments do you make to colleagues that hiring in European history matters?
I mean, this is a really tough question, right, Lauren? And, I don't know how other universities operate, but they're hiring in lots of regions matter. And it really depends on who you have on your faculty and what kinds of things you're offering and what people can teach and what people are doing research. And, I mean, I can make an argument that hiring in, modern British history matters because, my university doesn't have anyone that teaches modern British history. And it becomes really complicated when I'm doing, advising honors theses on Muslims in modern Britain. And I'm really trying to get up and learn everything I can about modern Britain, and that's tricky. But I could make the same argument for the modern Middle East and for the Indian modern, South Asia. And, so I don't know if the conversations quite happen that way in terms of, I'd be curious about other people's departments, but I think, at least in my own world, we very much recognize that there's lots of parts of history that are really critical and matter. And it feels actually quite Eurocentric to say, hire in mine instead, right? And I think the conversation is what is sort of grows and helps build collegiality. To say, listen, we need coverage in different areas. How do we, do that as a collective?
I would just echo, I think to make this, I think it's really, contact matters, we historians, right? So context is everything in some ways, but I think I would say similarly, it depends also if you're an R1, liberal arts, I think it's all unfortunately contextual, and I'm sorry to use that as a cop-out, but in terms of, we would make it in any other, like for any other geographic specification or modern or periodization. I think if the place does not have a position that, and I would make an argument that you have to have even if you're a very small department, a Europeanist who can teach widely and tune into a lot of the existing program and add interesting new ways of thinking about the world. I think it's essential, and I would like to see every university history department have at least one Europeanist, but I wouldn't make the case any other way for another above any other geographical location. So I think that we would then kind of defeat the purpose of our conversation today.
Yeah, and I know we're running out of time, but I think, so as someone who's in a studies department, basically, I think for me, the conversation is more, why does history matter? And I think history matters a lot for giving our students the ability to reimagine what's possible, right? If we can show them how things developed historically over time, then we can also allow them to imagine alternative possibilities of what the world might look like if we understand things as the result of a process and not fixed. I think that's true, no matter what geography you work on.
I have to agree, and I say that being in a school of European languages. So we have an institutional imperative to encourage more European studies, but nevertheless, the intellectual point is sound that European history is interesting and useful, just as other regional histories are. If the question is, does European history matter full stop or not? Yes, it does matter, because Europe has had such a dramatic influence, and European places have had such an influence around the globe, and that needs to be understood in the present. There's a political valence to that, but that doesn't necessarily mean, as far as hiring decisions, that it should just be, prioritizing of Europe across the board. But still, European history is relevant and important and interesting, as other fields are.
Great, thank you, everyone. I think we've all given us really gorgeous answers today to this question of, at a moment when the Academy is reckoning with the long legacies of Eurocentrism, how can European history be part of the solution to that rather than something that re-entrenches and perpetrates it. So thank you, everybody. If everybody can give our panelists a round of applause, and thank you, everybody, for spending your lunch hour or your evening hour with us. And we really appreciate it. And we wish you all a beautiful rest of your Wednesday.
Thank you so much, Lauren, for organizing this.
Thank you so
Lauren.
much.
It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank all of you. You were great.